McGraw-Hill, Living with Art, 13th edition, Part 5, Chapter 22, From Modern to Postmodern. Chapter outline: The New York School into the 1960s, Art of the 1960s and 1970s, Art of the 1980s and 1990s, Postmodernism. The New York School. New York replaced Paris as the center of the avant-garde art world after World War II. The New York School. Abstract Expressionism captured the artist movement in abstracted and non-representational paintings. The mid-century artist J. DeFeo took impasto to dramatic lengths. The strokes of oil paint in her non-representational origin look thick and doughy, especially toward the top. Rather than applying her paint with a brush, DeFeo used a metal knife, scooping up paint and layering it onto the canvas. Looking carefully at the top of the painting, we can see the individual strokes of the knife. DeFeo repeated the scooping and layering action over and over again, building up so many layers of thick paint that they stick out far above the canvas's surface. The impasto even cast a shadow against the remaining areas of paint. Elaine de Kooning adopted acrylic paint soon after its invention. Her non-representational painting, Bullfight, uses thick strokes of brightly colored acrylic paint. We can imagine the movement of de Kooning's body and the brush as she applied the paint in large sweeping motions. She made the yellow strokes on the right side of the painting when the brush was heavy with wet paint. The maroon stroke nearby, however, came from a mostly dry brush, allowing us to see the paper below. Though not a literal rendering of the bullfights de Kooning watched during the trip to Mexico, the acrylic painting's gestural brushwork effectively conveys the movement, frenzy, and blood and pain of the sport. The quintessential abstract expressionist was Jackson Pollock, who by the late 1940s had perfected his drip technique. To create such works as No. 1, 1949, Pollock placed the unstretched canvas on the floor and painted it indirectly from above by casting paint from a brush in a controlled gesture or by dripping paint from a stir stick. Layer after layer, color after color, the painting grew into a web of graceful arcs, dripping lines, spatters, and pools of color. There is no focal point, no composition. Instead, the paint rests on the surface of the canvas, and we find ourselves in front of a field of energy, like the spray of a crashing wave. A critic of the time coined the term action painting to describe the work of Pollock and others. For their paintings are not images in the traditional sense, but traces of an act, the painter's dance of creation. Pollock said his method of working allowed him to be in the painting, to forget himself in the act of painting, and that is also the best way to look at his work, to lose ourselves in them. The New York School. Action painting, color field painting, and their successors draw attention to the flatness of the canvas and the physical properties of paint. Strictly speaking, Pollock's painting is not abstract, but non-representational. The abstract expressionists we have already encountered in this book, Elaine de Kooning working in New York and J. DeFeo working in California, similarly made non-representational paintings. As always, the terminology of art evolved haphazardly and inconsistently as people grasped for terms to speak about what was new. Critics and artists of the day used abstract and non-representational interchangeably. In casual speech and in writing, abstract is still more the common term. Whereas Pollock developed a style that exploited the visual impact of gestures, lively, often forceful movements of the brush, hand, and arm, other abstract expressionists downplayed the drama of the gesture in favor of broad areas or fields of color. This variety of abstract expressionism is sometimes known as color field painting. Few traces remain of the gestures that Mark Rothko used to apply paint to this canvas. There are two soft-edged horizontal fields of color floating on a larger color rectangle of the canvas. Almost all of Rothko's mature paintings consist of variations on this simple but fertile ground. Soft-edged horizontal fields of color on a vertical color ground. The rectangle of the canvas and its echoes. Whereas Pollock emphasized the physicality and the dripping and pooling of paint, Rothko did the opposite, thinning his colors so much that the pigment powder barely holds to the canvas. The next generation of painters did not find much room to breathe in the heroic gestural style of action painting. The energy of color-filled painting, in contrast, was carried forward by a new generation of artists who explored and extended its possibilities. First and foremost among these was Helen Frankenthaler, who pioneered a staining technique. To create such non-representational paintings as Mauve District, Frankenthaler poured thin paint onto unprimed canvas spread on the floor and manipulated its flow in various ways. The colors soaked into the canvas like dyes binding with the fabric. Mauve District illustrates well the kind of airy, open composition that Frankenthaler excelled at. The white shape pushes against the bordering of the paint, while the colors seem to expand outward. When we look at it closely, the weave of the canvas emerges through the paint that stains it, reminding us that this is, after all, just paint on canvas. The New York School. Abstract Expressionist sculpture shares some of the characteristics such as scale seen in the movement's paintings. Rothko's paintings have a luminous, meditative quality. A similar contemplative mood infuses Louise Nevelson's wood assemblage Sky Cathedral. Nevelson was one of several New York-based sculptors whose work was associated with abstract expressionism. She began working with wood during World War II, at a time when other sculptors were using iron and steel, but she later said that welding metal had reminded her too much of the war. Her son was in the war. Everyone's son was in the war. She turned instead to cast off bits of wood, odd scraps of lumber, fragments of furniture, broken pieces of architectural details. It was with these materials that she found her voice as an artist and created her most characteristic works, the monumental, monochromatic assemblages often referred to as wall sculptures. Sky Cathedral is made of shallow wooden boxes filled with bits of scavenged wood, the whole painted black. At the more than 11 feet in height, it shares the abstract expressionist sense of scale. The monochrome paint unifies the diverse elements, emphasizing their abstract, formal qualities over their previous lives, which are now muted. Into the 1960s. Artists after abstract expressionism sought to return art's attention to daily life. Artist Jasper Johns chose as his subjects some of the most familiar images: a target, a map of the United States, numerals, letters of the alphabet, and the American flag. He said that if he chose these motifs, the work of composition had already been done for him, and he could, as he put it, concentrate on other things. What other things? Paradoxes, for one. Painted in encaustic over newsprint and mounted on 3 plywood panels, the collage flag is textured, sensuous, and unique. Even in a photograph, we see the bumpy surface and the thick brushstrokes made by the artist's hand. The white stripe at the top has such heavy impasto that the paint even casts a shadow. Elsewhere, blue paint drips down into a star, like Frankenthaler's painting. We are reminded that this is paint and that the artist has manipulated this paint. At the same time, we can peer through the paint at the collage newspaper underneath to get a little glimpse of life beyond the painting of the U.S. in the 1950s. Like all Johns' favorite motifs, the flag is not only familiar, but also two-dimensional, abstract, and symbolic. Is the painting a representation of a flag, or is it a flag, and what is the difference? It also teases us into thinking about aesthetics and emotional distance. For example, if we appreciate the painting as an abstract composition of stripes and stars, does that spare us from thinking about it as a national symbol in an era of tense Cold War politics? Into the 1960s. Assemblages brought together disparate items, giving them new meaning. Robert Rauschenberg's Canyon is what the artist called a combine, because the work combines found objects with paint and collage. A more general term for this kind of work is assemblage. Rauschenberg's found objects came from the streets of New York, in this case, a pillow and a stuffed eagle. To these, the artist added newspaper clippings, a metal drum, a flattened tube of paint, bits of cardboard, a postcard of the Statue of Liberty, a photograph of his son, and a man's t-shirt. These are familiar items, even if they are found out of context in this work of art. Using them allowed Rauschenberg to challenge the non-representational art of abstract expressionism. The artist gave viewers something to identify with and understand, although these are mostly in small bits and fragments. This hybrid work also challenged the definition of art. Is it two-dimensional painting? Is it a wall sculpture? Rauschenberg called it simply the world outside my window. Into the 1960s, artists after abstract expressionism explored art as an act or experience rather than a product, with performances and happenings. In an age when distances were bridged by mass media, Jackson Pollock's action paintings and the idea of art as an act rather than a product inspired a Japanese group known collectively as Gutae Art Association. Formed in 1954, Gutae performed public events as works of art. One of the most famous was Saburo Murakami's Laceration of Paper, in which the artist erected sheets of paper in frames, then violently burst through them. Viewers not only witnessed the artist performing this act, but also heard the sounds of ripping paper in a multisensory experience. The event also caused them to think about the nature of paper, about its material and its qualities, and about the body as it crashed through. Like all performative art, the experience that was created, it was the experience that created the art. No one could purchase it or display it on a wall. The only trace we have of the event was through the photographic documentation, like the image we see here. The fundamental characteristic of the work of art as a tangible object was undermined, as it has continued to be through present days. In the United States, artists similarly eliminated the art object and staged events, which they called happenings. Claus Oldenburg's Snapshots from the Streets was staged in 1960 as part of a larger happening titled Ray Gun Specs, or Specs. Oldenburg performed snapshots as an invented character called Ray Gun, an alter ego that the artist described as rude potency and vulgar art, a savior and a destroyer. During snapshots, Ray Gun lie among deterrents gathered from New York City's streets and assembled with a stage-like space. Bright light illuminated the scene before it was plunged into darkness. Humanity's quest for survival in the gritty space of the city, briefly seen and then hidden. Other performances during the happening featured artists from New York City's avant-garde community, including Jim Dine and Alan Capero. Art of the 1960s and 70s. Pop art links art to life, especially the consumerism and mass media of the post-war era. Andy Warhol's pop art pictures celebrities and politicians, commodities like Campbell's soup cans, and sensational news stories. For images like Orange Disaster No. 5, he began with a photograph that he transformed into a silkscreen print matrix. He then printed the screened image onto a colorfully painted canvas. In Orange Disaster No. 5, Warhol appropriated the photograph of an electric chair and execution chamber and copied it in several works, here printing it 15 times like a tabloid newspaper's rolling off the press. The repetition desensitizes us, despite the horrific subject matter, and Warhol used the same approach for other taboo themes in the disaster series, car crashes, suicides, and violence against civil rights protesters. The artist explained that he began painting this body of work after reading about a plane crash and noticing that the newspapers delivered similar tragedies to his doorstep every day. This never-ending flow of disastrous news was simply a condition of modern life, a sign of the times in contemporary culture. Roy Lichtenstein based his early paintings on hand-drawn advertising, then known as commercial art, and comic book imagery. He was intrigued by the conventions that these forms had developed for depicting the world, standardized ways of representing eyes, hair, glass, smoke, explosions, water, and even dripping brush strokes. Wham! was adapted from a frame in the comic series All American Men of War. Lichtenstein spread the original image across 2 canvases and reduced the color scheme to just a few colors. Most important, he enlarged it to over 13 feet wide, in the process enlarging the dot pattern of the printing. Comic books then were printed on newsprint using a system that permitted a palette of up to 64 colors, all printed with 4 colors of dots. The background tint and the shading on the plane of Wham are made of painted dots. By isolating images from their original context and dramatically shifting their scale, Lichtenstein drew our attention to the elements that they are made of: black lines, flat colors, and dots. He stopped drawing directly on comics within a few years, but he continued to work in his streamlined version of their style, cool, detached, and seemingly mechanical, for the rest of his life. Art of the 1960s and 1970s. Minimalist art explores pure form instead of representation and personal expression, usually using industrial materials. While pop art's focus on imagery in the mass media inspired artists to make representational works and paintings that looked as real as photographs, other artists continued to explore the possibilities of pure form. One group of sculptors wanted to rid art of representation and personal expression once and for all, and to allow viewers to, quote-unquote, see the whole idea without any confusion. Critics tried to categorize their work in many ways: primary structures, reductive art, literalism, but the label that stuck, despite the artist's objections, was minimalism. Donald Judd's Untitled Stack embodies many of the characteristics associated with minimalism. It is made of galvanized iron, a common industrial and construction material. The material is used literally. It does not try to depict or suggest anything else. The sculpture has the impersonal look of industrial fabrication. There is no trace of the artist's hand or touch that we saw in the sculptures of, say, Rodin. In fact, Untitled Stack was manufactured by a metal workshop according to Judd's specifications. The composition consists of repeating units of simple geometric mass. Precisely positioned in this case, boxes 9 inches in height displayed at 9-inch intervals. There is no focal point, no areas of greater or lesser interest. Art of the 1960s and 1970s. Post-minimalism process art focuses on how and why the object was made. Process art. Abstraction links Linda Bengelis's Embryo No. 2 to minimalism. Almost everything else about the work, however, stakes out a distance. Whereas minimalism favored tough industrial materials associated with construction, Embryo No. 2 consists of lobes of colored wax massed in high relief on a panel. Each organic shape was created by painting the melted wax onto the panel and then heating it with a blowtorch. In place of minimalism's precise geometry and manufactured look, the projecting lobes of Embryo No. 2 are casual and varied, and the piece is clearly handmade. And whereas minimalist works are pointedly about nothing but their own clarity, Embryo No. 2 feels more personal, intuitive, and intimate. It is like a small world of Bengelis's creation growing and changing. Art of the 1960s and 1970s. Post-minimalist installation art created spaces for viewers to experience and become aware of their presence. Dan Flavin's An Artificial Barrier of Blue, Red and Blue Fluorescent Light to Flavin Starbuck Jug is precisely what the title suggests, a barrier of blue and red light. The artist fashioned fluorescent light fixtures into rectangular boxes that he lined up across the corner of the room. Installing the bulbs in this way draws our attention to the shape of the room and blocks our access to the far corner. The installation also allows the walls, floor, and ceiling to become part of the work, as the red and the blue light that reflect off of the white wall creates a blue aura, magnifying the bulb's presence. The light also reflects off viewers as they approach the barrier and move through the space. All of these elements, bulbs, corners, walls, our bodies, become part of the installation. Flavin dictated the work to Flavin Judd, the son of his close friend, the minimalist sculptor Donald Judd. Art of the 1960s and 1970s, post-minimalist body art used the artist's body as material, while its performance art usually involved the artist engaging with the audience. Much of the performance art of the 1970s concerned the relationship between the artist and the spectator. An example is Imponderabilia, which the artist Marina Abramovich performed with her partner Ule in the museum in Italy. The two stood facing each other in a narrow doorway, naked, eyes locked, immobile, and expressionless. Anyone wanting to enter the museum had to get by them and squeeze through sideways, brushing against their bodies. Which way would the spectators face? Where would they look? How would they hold their hands? It is easy to imagine their discomfort, but it is almost frightening to consider the extreme vulnerability of the artists who were forbidden by the rules of the work to move or to speak. Many of Abramovich's works put her in a vulnerable position, and in some cases the spectators grew menacing. We do not know what might have happened here, for after 90 minutes the police were called to put an end to this piece. Ana Mendata used her body in performative actions that she documented in photographs. She posed in different contexts, sometimes inside and sometimes in nature. In Untitled, a work from her Silhouette series, the artist's arms are raised and her legs are together in a pose that suggests the soul moving through the space. Mendata let her body become integrated into the location. In this case, a niche in the wall of a church. She arranged sticks in the shape of her silhouette as a temporary trace of her presence. The photograph of the stick silhouettes remains as the only evidence of her intervention on the location. In other works in this series, Mendata covered her body with mud that camouflaged her against a tree, carved the shape of her body into the ground, and burned her silhouette into the earth using gunpowder. The artist called body-based performances earth body work and the earth body sculptures to visualize what she had described as a dialogue between her body and the land. Art of the 1960s and 1970s, post-minimalist land art transformed the natural world in temporary and permanent ways, challenging the idea of art as commodity. Nature has been more than a subject for art. It has also served as a material for art. Spiral jetty is an earthwork, a work of art made in earth itself or created with natural materials placed into nature. American artist Robert Smithson constructed this earthwork in 1970 in the Great Salt Lake, Utah. He had become fascinated with the ecology of the Salt Lakes, especially with the microbacteria that tinged the water shades of red. After viewing the Great Salt Lake in Utah, he leased a parcel of land on its shore and began to work on a large coil of rock and earth. Smithson was drawn to the idea that an artist could participate in the shaping of a landscape almost as a geological force. Spiral jetty continued to change according to the natural processes after it was finished. Salt crystals accumulated and sparkled on its edges. Depths of water in and around it took on different tints of transparent violet, pink, and red. Spiral jetty was submerged by the lake soon after it was created, but resurfaced in the early 2000s, transformed by a coating of salt crystals. With sun tunnels, Nancy Holt explored the intersection of art and science, reflecting her interest in time, light, and perception. Working in a remote area she owned in the Utah desert, Shapiro arranged 4 concrete tunnels at the right angles with a gap in the center. The tunnels are immense, measuring 18 feet long and 9 feet tall. They are dwarfed, however, by the vastness of the natural landscape that stretches out in every direction, making even these massive man-made objects seem small. Visitors walking among them seem even smaller. Each tunnel frames the setting or rising sun on the solstice and throughout the day. Frames a view of the Utah desert. The tunnels additionally have holes drilled into the side in the shape of constellations. These create ever-shifting patterns of light and dark, both inside and on the surface. The wind echoing the footsteps and the voices inside the tunnels offer a quiet soundtrack for the experience. Art of the 1960s and 1970s. Post-minimalist conceptual art places the idea behind the art ahead of its form and is designed to make the viewer think critically. Fountain was pure provocation. The exhibition organizers had stated that all works of art submitted for the exhibition would be accepted, and Duchamp wanted to see whether they really meant it. Yet, as Duchamp well knew, Fountain also raised interesting philosophical questions. Does art have to be made by an artist? Can artists call any object art? If so, how is an art object different from any other kind of an object? Does art depend on context, on being shown in an art place, such as a museum or a gallery? Can something be art in one place but not in another? Is Fountain still art today, or was it only art for the time that Duchamp said it was? Art sometimes turns its attention to art itself, making art, looking at art, finding the meaning and purpose of art, such as in this piece by Diego Velázquez. American artist Joseph Cornell is best known for his assemblages placed in boxes. In Untitled, parentheses, The Life of King Ludwig II of Bavaria, Cornell filled a wood carrying case with a printed book, a portfolio of pictures, a glass miniature of a swan, and its cardboard box. Another box with swan bones and ceramic decorated with swans. As the descriptions suggest, Cornell's assemblaged items, all created for different purposes, tell a story when brought together in the carrying case. Here, the story refers to the Persian king Ludwig II, his interest in swans, and his tragic suicide. Conceptualism is not a style, but a way of thinking about art, and artists have put it to different uses. Many conceptual artists worked with language, for words, when written, take on a double life as image and idea. Joseph Cowles, one of the foremost practitioners and theorists of conceptual art, illustrated this question in 1 and 3 chairs. He juxtaposed 3 elements, a chair, a black and white photograph of the same chair enlarged to life size, and a photographic enlargement of a dictionary definition for the word chair. In true conceptual fashion, the form is secondary, for the style of the chair doesn't matter. We are not meant to admire the design or the craftsmanship. It is just a chair. Nor does the definition matter. Even the arrangement of the 3 elements is irrelevant and can be changed. Letting 1 and 3 chairs take many forms. Instead, Cowles asks us which one is the chair, the assembled wood, the photograph, or the word, the object, its representation, or our language. Yoko Ono's Grapefruit is a conceptual artist book. An artist book is a work of art that is based on the idea of a book and what a book does. We accept that books are made of paper, are bound, and contain information. The artist book plays on these truths. Ono's book is filled with instructions, ranging from the practical to the illogical. One instruction asks the reader to walk through the city, stepping in every puddle. Another tells us to imagine 1,000 suns in the sky, then make and eat a tuna fish sandwich. The book acts like a script, turning the reader into a performer within this work of art. It also challenges the traditional role of the artist as being in charge of all aspects of the work. Ono developed the instructions over an 11-year period, gave them titles, and had them printed on paper in ordinary type in an edition of 500 copies. What happened afterward was beyond her control. Readers could treat the book as a book and put it on a shelf, or follow the instructions and become one of Ono's performers. Art of the 1960s and 1970s. Feminist art focuses on the biological, psychological, social, and historical experience of women. Feminist organizations had originally been formed around such issues as equal rights and equal pay. Because images are powerful and pervasive in contemporary society, visual culture quickly became a feminist concern, both in art and in the media. Women art professionals organized to recover women's art of the past, to push for more equitable representation in museums and galleries, and to nurture contemporary women artists. During this first phase of feminism, a project that intrigued many artists was the creation of specifically female art, rooted in the biological, psychological, social, and historical experiences of women. Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party is perhaps the most important work from this time. A collaborative work, The Dinner Party, was executed with the help of hundreds of women and several men. Arranged around a triangular table are 39 place settings, each one created in honor of an influential woman, such as the Egyptian ruler Hatshepsut and the novelist Virginia Woolf. The names of the additional 999 important women are written on the tiles of the floor. By using such craft techniques as ceramics, weaving, needlepoint, and embroidery, Chicago demands artistic equity for media that had long been associated with women's work. Confined to the domestic sphere, the vast majority of women throughout history had been limited to these expressive outlets, including the expressive outlet of setting and decorating a table, and the dinner party honors them. The 13 places on each side of the triangle intentionally evoke the seating arrangements of Da Vinci's Last Supper, a central work in the history of Western art, and one that depicts an all-male gathering. Art of the 1980s and 1990s. Postmodern art deconstructs, challenges, and lays bare what is typically hidden or assumed to be true. Art of the 1980s and 1990s. Postmodern architecture looks back at historical forms and embraces playfulness, curiosity, and eccentricity. Example 1. Guggenheim Museum, Bilbao, Spain, 1997, designed by architect Frank Gehry. Example 2. Zaha Hadid Architects, Burnham Pavilion, Installation Millennium Park, Chicago, 2009. A product of computer-aided design, the curved form sits lightly on the ground, as though it had just touched down and might take off again. We could think of this pavilion as a contemporary nomadic architecture, built on site for a centennial celebration in Chicago in 2009. It was designed so that it could be dismantled after the festival and erected elsewhere as desired. The term postmodern was first used to describe architecture such as Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers George's Pompidou National Center of Art and Culture. Designed in 1971 and completed 6 years later, the Pompidou Center created a sensation. Encased in scaffolding, pipes, tubes, and funnels, all color-coded according to function, it looked like a building turned inside out. It was architecture laid bare and deconstructed to reveal its underlying and normally hidden infrastructure. Art of the 1980s and 1990s. Postmodern appropriate challenges the notion of artistic authorship and originality. Sherry Levine's Fountain, after Marcel Duchamp, is a postmodern statement. Fountain was the most notorious of Duchamp's ready-mades, an ordinary porcelain urinal that he contributed to an art exhibition in 1917. Levine presented a gleaming bronze version. She created a number of afterworks, reinstating images made originally by such artists as Van Gogh and the photographer Walker Evans. She has said that what interests her is the almost same Duchamp's fountain, but with a slightly different urinal ends cast in bronze, or Evans photographed, rephotographed. Art of the 1980s and 1990s. Postmodern art challenges the stability of meaning and the idea that a work of art has just one meaning. Postmodern ideas about meaning, creativity, and the artist as authority are at play in Damien Hirst's The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. The work, which was commissioned by a prominent London art collector, consists of a dead tiger shark that Hirst purchased and suspended in a tank of formaldehyde. He later created a similar work, Heaven. Seen here, in some ways, Hirst's sharks are meditations on death. With the dead sharks representing our own mortality, they are also an exploration of images in terms of what is real and what is simulation. We are afraid of sharks mostly because of pictures, but these sharks are real. At the same time, the sharks here are treated as art objects by the commission and their display in the gallery. How are these works of art? They look like specimens from a natural history museum. And how does their display relate to the work's titles? In all these ways, the artist made the meaning unclear and unstable to allow each viewer to bring a unique perspective into its interpretation. Art of the 1980s and 1990s. Art in the 1980s and 1990s used language as art to offer social and political critique. Artist Ginny Holzer inserted words that closely resembled advertising slogans into public places. These conceptual projects used LED signs that displayed short critical messages or personal information on the types of signs we see every day. In one project, she put, "Protect me from what I want," on a sign over the Las Vegas Strip, and in another, "Private property created crime," above the New York Times Square. The photograph here shows her untitled installation at the Guggenheim Museum. In New York City in 1989, we see the statements, "When something terrible happens, people wake up," and "You are a victim of the rules you live by." Traveling around the museum's spiraling walkway, these declarations make us reflect and decide whether we agree or disagree. They provoke and admonish us, causing us to question our sense of autonomy and self-determination. A group of activists in New York City, known as Silence Equal Death Project, took up the cause to raise awareness of AIDS and to mobilize people to political action. They designed the poster Silence Equal Death in 1987. The work is simple yet bold, with a pink triangle on black paper. The pink triangle was adapted from the Nazi badge that they made gay prisoners wear in concentration camps. The poster's designers chose the Nazi badge for its association with death, but inverted the appropriated triangle to empower the gay community. The poster's white sans serif uppercase type makes its powerful statement about the damaging effects of silence. Smaller text below questions Reagan's inaction and encourages the gay community to mobilize and exercise political power. Turn anger, fear, grief into action. The poster's effect was immediate, and it quickly became a symbol of the fight against AIDS. Art of the 1980s and 1990s. Art of the 1980s and 1990s challenged the art world's treatment of women and people of color. Example 1. Gorilla Girls. Do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? 1989. Screen print on paper. Lorraine O'Grady's untitled Malay Bourgeoisie Noir raises issues of race, gender, and class, and critiqued complacency in the face of prejudice and discrimination against Black Americans. Wearing a dress made of the white gloves worn by middle and upper-class ladies in the 1950s, and carrying a cat of nine tails of sailing rope, O'Grady assumed the persona of the fictional beauty queen Mademoiselle Bourgeoisie Noire, 1955, Miss Black Bourgeoisie. As O'Grady has explained, the whip and its connection to slavery represents external repression. The glove dress symbolized the internalization of that oppression as a self-censorship and participation in the middle-class social rituals. O'Grady crashed art openings as Mademoiselle Bourgeoisie Noire, whipping herself and reciting poems that challenged Black artists to reject a prejudiced art world. She urged the rejection of the non-representational art that white critics, gallery owners, and museum trustees championed, declaring instead that Black art must take more risk rather than seek to fit in. James Luna also confronted the art world in Artifact Piece. As a member of the Latino people, Luna objected to how U.S. society represented and treated Native Americans. Popular culture pictured Native Americans as stereotyped sports mascots or as a romanticized, vanishing people. All wore feathered headdresses and buckskin clothing, despite the wide diversity of Native cultures in North America. Museums displayed sacred artifacts collected under questionable practices as specimens of natural history rather than as holy objects or as art. Native culture was only permitted a fictionalized and limited existence in dominant narratives. In his performance Artifact Piece, James Luna made himself the specimen, and in the process not only called out museums for their practices, but also visitors for their complicity. Wearing only a loincloth, Luna lay in a museum display case accompanied by objects from life, his divorce documents, his college diploma, and family photographs. The accompanying label explained that the exhibited items and identified scars on Luna's body. Visitors studied Luna, staring at his body without regard for his humanity. Some poked at him. When Luna moved, however, he forced viewers to see him as a living, modern human being just like themselves, not an antiquity or a scientific specimen. They were made painfully aware of their privileged position to gaze upon Luna's exposed body. Art of the 1980s and 1990s. Postmodern art examines history and authority. Our ideas about art, our relationship with the past, and postmodern's critical stance towards authority also lie at the heart of Ai Weiwei's Dropping the Han Dynasty Urn. In the 3 photographs documenting the performance, Ai stares out at us as he drops a Chinese Han Dynasty vessel. He impassively confronts us and our shock at his destruction of a 2,000-year-old work of art. Our shock stems from the value that we place on art. Cultural norms have taught us that items like this should be preserved in museums and kept safe from damage. Yet Ai's performance is also a work of art, calling the urn a cultural ready-made. Like a more sophisticated version of Duchamp's urinal, Ai claimed to transform it from its old state as a vessel to its new state as part of a performance. Ai's performance had larger goals than unmasking our concerns for antiques. The Han Dynasty is considered a formative period for the Chinese culture, an era of peace, prosperity, and territorial expansion. When Ai Weiwei returned to China after an extended period in the United States, he saw Han Dynasty objects devalued, sold for pennies, or destroyed by construction projects. China's cultural heritage was falling prey to the nation's economic boom and efforts to modernize. To draw attention to the issue, I collected Chinese antiques and transformed them into works of contemporary art. Dipping Neolithic pottery in garish colors, reworking Ming Dynasty furniture, painting a Coca-Cola logo across the vase, and, of course, smashing an urn. As I explained, taking contradictions and making them public is my best weapon. This concludes Chapter 22.